Sometimes the ones we throw away become someone else's miracle. Montana, November 1894. The wind howled through the frozen woods, carrying the cries of a girl who had lost everything. Clara Reeves, only 22, stood in the snow as her parents walked away after selling her to a stranger. They called her cursed, a woman who could never give life, and left her to face a world colder than the storm around her. Her heart trembled, her tears turning to ice on her cheeks. She didn't know where to go or why she was still breathing, but fate had already marked her path. Deep within those same woods, a lonely lumberjack named Ethan Cole swung his axe in silence, his soul heavy with the memory of a wife he had buried 3 winters ago. He had 4 children, a heart full of sorrow, and no idea that a broken girl wandering in the snow was about to change his life forever. The snow kept falling heavier, covering Clara's torn shoes as she walked through the endless white fields, her breath shallow, her body trembling from cold and fear. The stranger her parents had sold her to waited beside an old wagon, his face hidden under a hat soaked with snow. Without a word, he grabbed her arm and pushed her inside, the wooden floor biting against her skin. The wagon moved through the storm, creaking with every turn, and the sound of the wind mixed with Clara's silent sobs. She pressed her hands together, whispering a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was still listening. The trader's eyes were hard, empty of mercy, and his hands reeked of smoke and greed. He spoke only once, saying she'd fetch a good price in town, and then fell quiet again. Hours passed like a nightmare that wouldn't end, until the wagon hit a deep rut and one of the wheels snapped. The man cursed and jumped out, his boots sinking in the snow as he tried to fix it. Clara looked around. The woods were endless, dark, and filled with shadows. She thought of running, but her legs were weak, her body frozen. Then through the wind she heard a distant sound, a rhythmic chopping, faint but steady like a heartbeat. The trader didn't notice. He was too busy shouting at his horse. Clara's heart raced as the sound grew closer, the steady echo of an axe hitting wood. A figure appeared through the swirling snow, a tall man, broad-shouldered, his face hidden behind a scarf, his axe resting on his shoulder. The trader shouted at him to stay away, but the stranger ignored him, his deep voice cutting through the storm as he asked what was happening. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat felt locked. The trader snarled, saying the girl was his property, but the stranger's eyes darkened as he saw the bruises on Clara's wrist. He didn't ask more questions. He simply reached for her arm and pulled her gently behind him. The trader stepped forward, his voice rising in anger, but one sharp look from the stranger silenced him. The wind howled louder, the snow swirling around them as if nature itself wanted to hide what would happen next. The man spoke again, calm but firm, telling the trader to leave before the storm buried them both. For a moment, the trader hesitated, his face pale under the gray sky. Then he climbed onto the broken wagon and vanished into the storm. Clara stood trembling, unsure if she should thank or fear the man before her. His name, he finally said, was Ethan Cole. He lived deep in the forest with his children and had no reason to help anyone, yet something in her eyes had made him stop that night. He took off his coat, wrapping it around her shaking shoulders, and said softly, "You'll freeze if you stay here. Come on, I'll take you somewhere warm." And for the first time, Clara followed, not because she trusted, but because she had nothing left to lose. Clara followed Ethan through the dense forest, her legs weak and her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The snow whispered beneath their feet, and the trees stood tall like silent witnesses to her broken past. She didn't know where he was taking her, but something about his quiet strength made her heart slow from panic to a strange calm. His steps were steady, his shoulders broad beneath a worn flannel coat, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, shaped by years of solitude. "It's not far," he said without turning back. Clara wanted to speak, to thank him, but fear held her tongue. Every sound in the woods felt alive, the wind brushing through branches, the distant cry of a wolf, the creak of old trees bending under the snow. When they reached a small clearing, she saw a cabin made of dark timber, smoke curling softly from its chimney. The warmth of that sight almost broke her. Ethan opened the door and motioned her inside. The room smelled of pine and firewood, simple but safe. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, and beside it lay a pair of tiny boots, a reminder that children lived here. She hesitated, unsure if she belonged anywhere anymore, but Ethan's calm presence drew her in. He poured her a cup of water, his hands rough and scarred from years of labor, and said nothing while she drank. She noticed the sadness in his eyes, the weight he carried in silence. It wasn't the cold that made him quiet, it was grief. From another room came the sound of small footsteps, and 4 children peeked out, 3 boys and a little girl, their eyes wide with curiosity. Clara froze, afraid they would see her as something unwanted just as her own family had. But the youngest girl, no older than 6, smiled and offered her a piece of bread with small trembling hands. Clara took it gently, her throat tightening with emotion. Ethan introduced them briefly, his voice softer when he spoke their names, but he didn't explain who Clara was. He simply said she needed a place to stay until the storm passed. That night, Clara sat near the fire, wrapped in a blanket he had given her, watching the flames dance while Ethan repaired a broken chair in silence. Outside the storm roared, but inside time felt suspended. She studied him carefully, the way his brow furrowed when he worked, the faint trace of kindness that hid beneath his rugged face. When he looked up, their eyes met for a fleeting second and she quickly looked away. For the first time since being sold, she didn't feel like an object. She felt seen. Ethan didn't ask about her past or her pain. Instead, he placed another log on the fire and said quietly, "You can rest here tonight." His words weren't loud, but they carried warmth deeper than any flame. And for Clara, that was the first spark of safety she had felt in years. The storm passed, but Clara stayed, her presence becoming part of the rhythm of the small cabin hidden between the pine trees. Each morning, she rose before the sun, lighting the fire while the children still slept, her hands moving softly over the table as she prepared breakfast. The cabin, once cold and silent, began to fill with the gentle hum of life again. The sound of a broom sweeping the floor, the laughter of children chasing each other outside, and the faint melody Clara hummed when she worked. Ethan often watched her from the porch as he chopped wood, noticing how her quiet strength held the house together without a single word of complaint. The children, who had once avoided strangers, now followed her everywhere. She mended their torn clothes, told them stories by the fire, and kissed their scraped knees like she had always belonged there. Yet at night, when the world went still, Clara's heart carried a secret that burned quietly inside her. She feared that if Ethan ever discovered she could never give birth, he would see her the same way her parents did, broken and unwanted. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an unreadable expression, his gaze soft yet heavy, as though he too carried something unspoken. The air between them was always filled with things neither dared to say. One evening, as the sky turned crimson behind the mountains, Clara stood by the window, drying a bowl while Ethan repaired the roof beam. His youngest daughter, Lila, climbed onto her lap and asked if she would stay forever. The question struck deep, her voice trembling as she answered that forever was a long time. Lila smiled and whispered, "Then stay a long time." Clara hugged her tightly, blinking back tears as Ethan's hammering paused for a moment, his eyes shifting toward them. Days turned into weeks, and the snow began to melt into silver streams that ran through the forest floor. The scent of pine and smoke blended with the quiet warmth that filled their small world. Every night, Clara sat by the fire waiting for Ethan to return from the woods, her heart fluttering when she heard his footsteps on the porch. He never said much, but when he nodded at her in gratitude after a meal or handed her a mug of tea before speaking to the children, she felt something she couldn't name, something dangerously close to peace. Still, she lived with the fear that her truth could destroy it all. In silence, she prayed that the past would stay buried beneath the snow, that no one would remind Ethan of what she truly was. Because for the first time since she had been sold, Clara felt like she belonged to something real, something almost like love, and she couldn't bear to lose it before it had even begun. The evening sky turned copper as the last light of day slipped behind the mountains, and Clara stood outside the cabin hanging the children's clothes near the fire pit, her thoughts lost in the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. Inside, Ethan sat at the table sharpening his axe when a faint knock echoed through the door. It was the town doctor, a kind man who visited rarely, carrying his worn bag and a look of concern. He greeted Ethan politely, his voice low, and asked if he could speak in private. Clara stepped aside, her hands trembling slightly, though she didn't know why. From the window, she watched the two men talk, the doctor's expression turning serious, his voice hushed but urgent. Ethan's eyes darkened as he listened, his hand frozen mid-motion on the table. The doctor's words carried through the crack of the door. He spoke of Clara, of what had happened before she came to the forest, and how her condition meant she could never bear children. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching like the night itself. Clara's chest tightened, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The secret she had buried so deeply had found its way to the only man who had shown her kindness. When the doctor left, the door creaked softly, and Ethan stood still for a long moment, his figure lit by the glow of the fire. Clara couldn't look at him. She turned toward the snow, her eyes blurring, and whispered that she would leave in the morning. But Ethan's footsteps moved toward her, slow and steady. He stopped just behind her, his voice deep but calm, the kind of calm that carried more truth than anger ever could. "You think this changes anything?" he asked quietly. Clara didn't answer. Her throat burned as she tried to speak, but no sound came. He took a slow breath and said, "I already have 4 who needed a mother. Maybe that's why God sent you." The words broke something inside her, something heavy that had lived in her for years. Tears filled her eyes, but they were no longer from shame. She turned to face him, and for the first time she saw that he wasn't looking at her with pity. He looked at her the way a man looks at a promise kept. The children, hearing their voices, peeked from the doorway, confusion mixing with curiosity. Ethan smiled faintly at them, then looked back at Clara. "You belong here," he said simply. The fire crackled behind them, the sound soft and steady, echoing the heartbeat she thought she had lost long ago. She reached for his hand, the roughness of his skin grounding her in a world that finally felt safe. The fear that had ruled her for so long melted like snow under sunlight. And in that quiet winter night, surrounded by the family she had never expected to have, Clara felt something she had never known before. Peace, pure and unshakable, born from love that asked for nothing in return. Spring came softly to Montana, brushing the hills with green and melting the last traces of winter. Beneath the tall pines, Clara stood in a simple white dress, her hands trembling as Ethan slipped a silver band around her finger. The children surrounded them with wildflowers in their hair, their laughter weaving through the breeze like music. For the first time, Clara felt the weight of her past lift, the voices of those who had called her cursed fading into nothing. She looked at Ethan, his eyes warm and steady, and knew that love wasn't about what was lost. It was about what was found. As the sun dipped behind the trees, he whispered that no one was ever broken, only waiting to be understood. In that moment, Clara realized she had never been sold. She had been saved. And when the wind carried their vows through the forest, her soul finally felt home.